We're on DAF Peiches Amid Aleph, and what we're discussing today is a continuation of our discussion of this mechitza tluya, of this suspended box that you're allowed to use on the side of your house in order to be able to draw water from the lake that's adjacent to your home. This has been the topic of our conversation for a number of days, and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna qualifies this, and he says, Lo shanu ela lamalos aval lishboch aser. He says that the only heter that you have is to draw water using that box apparatus from the lake, but you do not have permission to pour out wastewater, sewage water. That you do not have permission to do, even though you're essentially doing the same thing, is that you're basically creating the box, creates a reshus hayachid over the part of the water that you want to pour it into. But nevertheless, it's usher because since invariably the water will drift away and will be caught away by the current, so you're essentially causing the water that's in a reshus hayachid to go into a karmelis. And that's why it's not okay. So maskif la Rav Shizvi v'chima bein zeh le'uka. So the Gemara's question is, well, how is this different from an uka? Now, an uka is a concept that we're going to see today in just a few lines in the very next Mishnah. The very next Mishnah is going to tell us that if I have wastewater that I want to dispose of, I can pour it into a chutzner, even a small chutzner, provided that I create a hole in the ground that will catch some of the water. But I can pour theoretically an unlimited amount of water, even if the hole is already filled with water, such that invariably the water will run off into a reshus harabim. Why is it permitted over there, even though you know that invariably the water is going to spill out into reshus harabim, whereas over here you're telling me that it's aser? So the Gemara answers, Hani taimi v'hani lo taimi. Answers the Gemara that in that case of the pouring wastewater into your chutzner, there's also a good chance that as it's spilling out, it's also going to absorb into the soil. And because a large portion of it will absorb into the soil, it's not as guaranteed that the water is going to be spilling into the reshus harabim. But over here, it's almost immediate that as soon as you pour your wastewater into this apparatus and then falls into the lake, Peiches. Peiches.
He gave me Peiches.
That's right.
Okay. But over here, the water will almost immediately flow out into the Carmelis, and therefore it's aser. Ika da Amri, others learn the sugya just the opposite. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna lo tema lemalos udeshari lishboch aser. That Rabba bar Rav Huna says, we're not suggesting that it's only mutter to draw water from the lake, but it's even mutter to pour out water, wastewater, into the lake as well. El lishboch nami shari. So Amar Rav Shizvi pshita hainu uka. So Rav Shizvi says, Shkoyach, what do you need to tell me that for? That's obvious because we know that from the next Mishnah about pouring wastewater into a chutzner. So the Gemara says, Mahu detema hani taimi v'hani lo taimi, kamash malan. No, you might have thought that there's a distinction between the two, as we just made. That in the case of pouring wastewater into a chutzner, much of the water absorbs into the soil before it runs out, and that's why it's permitted. But over here, the water does not absorb in its place, and therefore maybe there's more of a reason to say that it's aser. Kamash malan, that in both cases, since you're pouring the water into a reshus hayachid before it flows out into a karmelis or reshus harabim, it's okay. Okay. Now let's finish off the Mishnah. The last part of the Mishnah had said, V'chein shtei gezus tro zu v'chulei. The famous case that we had seen a couple of times already is you have these two boards that are protruding from the house, two balconies, shall we say, and the top balcony, in other words, they're situated adjacent to each other and one is higher than the other. The top balcony has the cutout hole in it and has the box apparatus below it, and therefore it's used to draw water from the lake below. The only problem is that since the resident of the lower balcony has access to the upper balcony, if Reuven and Shimon, if they did not make an eruv with each other, then Shimon precludes Reuven from using his apparatus because it's now a karmelis, it's now a public or semi-public property, it's not an individually owned property. And so that's going to be the topic of the discussion over here. So first of all, Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav Lo Shanu Ela B'Samucha Abel B'Muflages Elyona Muteres. That halacha is only true that Shimon precludes Reuven from using the apparatus to draw water when the two balconies are horizontally proximal to each other, when they're nearby each other. But if they're distant from each other, so then it's not going to be a problem. And distant we had defined as more than 4 tvachim. 4 tvachim are more of a distance away, then it's not a problem. And the Gemara explains, V'Rav l'taime, that Rav goes according to his reasoning, D'Amar Rav ein adam osra al chaver derech chavir, that if the only way to access your friend's property is through throwing something in the air, then that is not considered to be having a stake in the other person's property. So since they're sufficiently distant from each other such that the only way that Shimon can get his bucket over to Reuven's balcony is by throwing it, he can't just stretch his arm, that makes it such that Shimon is no longer a stakeholder in Reuven's balcony, and therefore Reuven has complete autonomy, and it's considered to be a total Rishus HaYachid, and he can draw water on his own.
This is more than 4 tvachim apart.
More than 4 tvachim apart.
So you're allowed to throw something in a Carmelis from a Rishus HaYachid?
You can't normally throw from a Rishus HaYachid to a Carmelis.
But it's more than 4 tvachim apart, they're not in the same Rishus anymore, the two balconies.
They're not in the same Rishus. That's the whole point. The whole point is that since they're no longer accessible from one to the other, Shimon really is no longer someone who can easily access Reuven's property.
So I don't understand why it says you cannot restrict by the air. You can't. The fact that it sounds like it's permissible to throw it in the air by what the Gemara is saying, but I didn't think it would be permissible because it's from one issue over a Carmelis to another issue.
Well, I think the two things are happening simultaneously. In other words, they go hand in hand. The very fact that the only way that I can access it is by tossing something, 4 tvachim is not a lot, so it's certainly the only isser is throwing something arba amos, right? Right? If you're throwing it in a Rishus Harabim. So one might have argued that since it's a shared property and you're throwing it less than 4 amos, then there's no problem. The answer is no. Since Shimon can only access Reuven's property through throwing, they're considered to be two completely distinct domains. And therefore Reuven is the sole stakeholder in his balcony, and therefore he can draw water. Okay. Amar Rabbi, Amar Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yoseph, Amar Rabbi Oshia, these two Amoraim say, Yesh gezel b'Shabbos, b'chur v'machzer l'ba'olim. Now, it's a cryptic statement. The Havamin of the Gemara is as follows. Yesh gezel b'Shabbos means that you can steal something on Shabbos. That doesn't mean you can steal. That doesn't mean gezel is mutter. What it means is that, let's say, I live in a chutzner where there's an adjacent property which is vacant, like a ruin is the example that Rashi gives. Now, if you do a title search on the property of the ruin, it's really owned by Shimon. I'm Reuven, he's Shimon, and he's really the owner. But I've been using that property all week. Shimon's abandoned it. He's not really interested in it, and I'm sure he doesn't mind if I go ahead and use it. So I go ahead and I put my jugs there, I put my kalim there, whatever. Now Shabbos comes. So the question is, do I have to make an eruv with Shimon in order to be able to utilize that property? Or can we say that since I've been using it anyway, so based on the facts on the ground, it's from a utilitarian point of view, it's really mine, and therefore I don't have to make an eruv anymore. So the answer is yesh gezel b'Shabbos. Go ahead, you can take it, it's yours. You don't have to make an eruv. That's the implication. B'chur v'machzer l'ba'olim. And then the second statement seems to contradict the first statement, that on Shabbos the ruin returns back to the owner, and therefore you would have to make an eruv. So the first part of the phrase implies that you don't have to make an eruv, and the second part of the phrase implies that you do have to make an eruv. And that's why the Gemara asks Hagu Fakasha. This in itself is a contradiction. Amarti yesh gezel b'Shabbos al makani b'chor v'machzel l'ba'alam al malokani. The first part says that the fact that you've been using it all week with impunity implies that it's sort of like yours for the purposes of Shabbos, and you don't have to make an eruv. The second statement implies that it goes back to the owner on Shabbos, and you would have to make an eruv with Shimon in order to be able to use the chorva. So the Gemara answers Hachi Kamer yesh din gezel b'Shabbos and keitzad the chorva machzer l'ba'alam. The way you have to read it is that there's a halacha of a prohibition of gezel on Shabbos, which means that you're obligated to return stolen objects back to their owner. So if you've been stealing, so to speak, the use of the chorva all week, you've got to return it on Shabbos, and therefore, if you want to be able to use it on Shabbos, you have to make an Eruv, a duly constituted Eruv with Shimon, who's the real landowner. So Amar Rabba umosvinan ashmaitin. So this halacha, which says that you can't just automatically assume rights of use just because no one's protesting, is contradicted by our Mishnah, because our Mishnah said v'chein shtei gezustro zula ma'ila mizu v'chulei v'iomarti yeshdin gezel b'Shabbos amaya suros. Now remember, we're talking about an apartment building. Reuven is the owner of the top balcony. Shimon's the owner of the bottom balcony. And basically what we said is that Shimon can preclude Reuven from using his bucket to draw water from his mechitza tluya, from his box apparatus on Shabbos. But why should that be? If the top balcony is solely owned by Reuven, just because Shimon uses Reuven's balcony, but it's Reuven's balcony. So why can't Reuven basically say, look, it's not yours, it's mine, I'm taking possession of it, get out of my way, it's my balcony. And yet the Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah says, no, the fact that Shimon has access to it and occasionally uses it is an indication that they have to make an Eruv. But why should that be? Look at the title, look at the ownership of the balcony, and you'll see that it's solely owned by Reuven, so why should Reuven have to reckon with the fact that Shimon uses it? So the Gemara explains, so the Gemara says, Amar Rav Sheishes hacha b'mayaskinon kigon sha'asim l'chitza b'shutfus. The answer is that we're talking about a case where Reuven and Shimon initially collaborated together to construct the box apparatus which would allow them to draw water. In other words, basically Reuven and Shimon spoke to each other one day and they said, look, we have balconies that are close enough to each other. Why should we both have to go to the bother of constructing our own box apparatus on our balconies in order to draw water on Shabbos? I'll just build one and you can use it whenever you want. And that was the arrangement. And because Shimon is a shutaf, he's a partner in the construction of that box, therefore he becomes a stakeholder and therefore they have to make an Eruv. So frek the Gemara ihachi ki asul l'tachtona nami. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, then why do we know that the halacha is that when Shimon makes his own box apparatus on his balcony, then even if they are proximal of 4 tfachim to each other, then Reuven does not have to make an Eruv with Shimon in order to be able to use his box alone. L'chora, if Shimon contributed towards the construction of Reuven's box on his balcony, even if Shimon built his own box, then it would require Reuven to make an Eruv with Shimon because Shimon is still a stakeholder. So the Gemara says, no, Kevin da'asal l'tachtona gilui goli daita da'ana bahadach lo nichali. Once Shimon builds his own box, then he's revealed through his actions that he no longer wishes to be a partner in Reuven's box on his balcony.
Oh, the second guy. Like we've got two guys each with their own box now.
Yeah, Reuven and Shimon, right. So once Shimon has put his own box on his balcony, he's demonstrated through his actions that he no longer wishes to be a stakeholder in Reuven's balcony. And even therefore, if the balconies are proximal to each other within 4 tfachim, Reuven is allowed to draw water and treat it as a complete rishus hayachid without an eruv. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah requires a little bit more of an imagination of the layout of a Talmudic courtyard. So it's a little bit, the image in my mind is a little bit not as crystal clear as the previous illustrations, but close enough. Let's take a look. Chatzer shehi pechusa me arba amos. If you have a courtyard that is less than 4 by 4 or 4 square amos in area, so then we have to be concerned that when you pour wastewater into your chutzner, it's going to run off into the Rishus Harabim with greater immediacy. And therefore, ein shotchen b'socha mayim b'Shabbos, ele im kein asu la'uka machzekes asayim min hanekev u'lomata. That then we don't allow you to pour wastewater into the chutzner unless you first dig a hole in your chutzner that can hold 2 sa'as of water. And in that way, it's almost like a drain. So you allow the water to drain into the hole, and then if there's additional water and it runs out into Rishus Harabim, at least you've demonstrated that it's not your objective to cause the water to run out into Rishus Harabim. And therefore it's okay. And the reason why it's okay is because since you're pouring it into your own Rishus, and on its own it runs out into Rishus Harabim, you're really not doing anything wrong. So the Gemara now the Mishnah now says, and by the way, I just want to point out, when we say that you're allowed to pour wastewater into your chutzner, we're dealing with a chutzner where nothing is growing; it's just dirt. If you have a lawn, then there's an Isser on Shabbos of pouring wastewater onto your lawn on Shabbos because of Zoreya. You're watering. You're not allowed to water a lawn on Shabbos. So just keep that in mind. We're talking about just a dirt lot in your chutzner, okay? And then the Mishnah says, Bein mi bachutz, bein mi bafnim, ela shemi bachutz tzarach likmor, mi bifnim ein tzarach likmor. And the Mishnah then clarifies is that this hole does not have to actually be in your chutzner. It could actually be outside your chutzner already in the Rishus Harabim. If, however, the hole is in Rishus Harabim, the hole has to be covered with planks. And the reason why the hole has to be covered with planks, not just because of the Choshen Mishpat issue of Bor Rishus Harabim, which could be obviated in a number of different ways, but there's an additional issue here. The additional issue is that if the water runs straight from my chutzner into the hole, which is in Rishus Harabim, so I'm not resolving anything. But by putting a board over it, I'm causing the hole in the ground to really be considered a makom petur, its own separate domain. And a makom petur, you're allowed to transfer from a rishus hayachet to a makom petur, and then if it goes from the makom petur into the rishus harabim because it overflows and runs outward, then it's perfectly fine. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, he says, Bib shehu kamur arba amos b'rishus harabim. He now is addressing a different case. He's talking about a case where you have an actual aqueduct. In other words, there's an indentation in your soil of your chutzner that is specifically meant for runoff of liquids that you dispose of from your property. If it is at least 4 amos in length in your property, so b'rishus harabim bibshu kamor arba amos b'rishus harabim, if it runs out of your property, this aqueduct, and it is covered at least 4 amos with planks in Rishus Harabim, so then shovchin l'socha mayim b'Shabbos. Then you're allowed to lichatchila pour water into this aqueduct on Shabbos, because even though you know that it's going to run out into Rishus Harabim, but it's not running out directly into Rishus Harabim, because since a portion of the aqueduct is covered, it's running into a makom petur first, and only later running into a Rishus Harabim. The Chachamim Omrim, but the Chachamim disagree, and they say, no, this is worse than pouring water into your chutzner, because here you're pouring water directly into an aqueduct, and therefore the Chachamim say that that's never permitted. They say, Afilu gago chutzner mea ama lo yishpoch al pi habib, aval shochechu legag v'hamayim yordim lebiv. They say, no, you can never pour water directly into the aqueduct, and that's true even if the length of your chutzner or your rooftop is 100 amos long, and it'll take the water 100 amos to run off into the Rishus Harabim. It's still usher because you're pouring it directly into the aqueduct, so your action reflects that you desire this water to run out of your property. And rather what you have to do is you have to pour it onto the surface of the chutzner or the rooftop, and then let the water itself on its own run into the aqueduct and then run out of your property. The next thing that the Mishnah says is, Hechotzer v'ha'achsadra mitztarfin la'arba amos, that if you have a split-level courtyard, which basically what that means is that you have ground level, and the ground level is not 4 square amos. And therefore, if you were just looking at the ground level, you would say, you know what, the only way that you can spill water into here is if you dig a hole. Right? That's the only way we're going to let you do it. But no, the Mishnah says is that if, however, let's say you have a deck on the side of this courtyard that services, let's say, the second floor of the apartment that's in this, or the house that's in this property, so then you can count that as part of the floor plan of 4 by 4 amos. And therefore, as long as you take into account the square footage of the deck or of the elevated part of the chutzner, and you conjoin it with the ground level floor space of the chutzner, and you get 4 square amos, so then you no longer have to dig a hole. You don't have to dig this uka that we talked about earlier. So, and v'chein shnei diyuto zu keneged zu, mikzasen asu uka, mikzasen lo asu uka, es sha'asu uka mutarin, es shalo asu uka asurin. And then the final case of the Gemara is that let's say you have a chutzner which has 2 residences, and each residence has its own deck, has its own elevated portion, which is exclusively the purview of the individual house. And then there's a shared courtyard on ground level that is shared between the two of them. Let's say that the square footage, even with the decks, is less than 4 by 4 amos, in which case they have to dig an uka, they have to dig a hole. So the Mishnah says if the hole was dug closer to one house's deck than the other, only the house that has the hole next to it is allowed to pour water onto out of its house so that it can flow into the hole, but the other house would not be allowed to pour its water out. Now, we're going to see why. It's very unclear from this illustration whether did the two houses make an eruv, did they not make an eruv. This is going to be the discussion of the Gemara momentarily. But let's go back to our first cases. The Gemara now says, yeah.
I'm not fully clear on what the difference is between making a eruv. Meaning at the end of the day, the water's running out.
Right.
Right?
So it's a question of Giloy Das. It's a question of what you demonstrate through your actions. When you have a chutzner that's less than 4 by 4, by digging a hole, you're demonstrating that your objective is not that the water should get from your property to the outside.
You're making a pit.
Yeah, you're making a pit so that the water should catch, right? Okay? So the Gemara now says, my taima. Amar Rabba, mipnei sha'adam asu lihistapek masayim mayim b'chol yom. So the Rabba explains the reason why you have to dig this hole is because normal usage per family or per home, which is a very vague statement, but normal usage per person of wastewater, how much wastewater does a person dispose of on average during the day? 2 sa'as of water, okay? And ba'ar ba'amos adam rotze lizalfan, pachos midalid shovchan. And generally speaking, and this of course is a very vague generalization, but we're going to say it anyway. In other words, when you have 2 sa'as of wastewater, that's not considered wastewater in Talmudic times. People always have use of wastewater. What would you use wastewater for? Well, if you have a dirt floor, you're going to use it to pat down the earth on your property. And that's typically what people use when they have wastewater, when you boil potatoes and you got to throw out the water. So you don't just toss it out. You use it for some constructive use.
That's what they call wastewater. I thought wastewater was like human waste.
It could be washing your hands. It's also wastewater.
Any water that you use in your home, like washing the dishes, right? In those, right? So remember, we don't have indoor plumbing here. So water is a commodity, right? It's of a higher commodity than we consider it today, right? We don't think anything of turning on the faucet and letting the water run. But in those days, every drop is precious, right?
There's
so
2 types actually. There's gray water and white and sewage.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're probably talking about gray water then. Yeah.
Like the potatoes, it's gray.
Right. So anyway, so the point is that you're going to want to use this water if provided that it's a certain amount you have use for it, and therefore by pouring it out into your chutzner, you're not automatically demonstrating that you want to dispose of it as long as you dig a hole that it can hold 2 sa'as. So that you're demonstrating that the 2 sa'as, that is my normal usage, I'm trying to preserve, and I'm not trying to get rid of and get it out of my chutzner. And that's why the rabbis required you to dig that hole that can hold 2 sa'as of water, because that's a sufficient demonstration that my normal daily usage of water is not, when I pour it out, I'm not desirous of it seeping out of my property. I want to try and preserve it.
So you go back and use it.
No, you don't have to use it. All you need to do is dig a hole. Whether it runs out or not is irrelevant. And the truth is, even if I end up spilling out 100 sa'as of water,
Right.
as long as I dug that hole, that's sufficient demonstration.
Because there might be 20 people living there. It doesn't matter.
That's right.
It's just demonstrating.
Exactly. And that's the opinion of Rabbah. And Reb Zera says a different opinion, slightly different. He says, Dalet Amos taimi, pachos mi Dalet Amos lo taimi. He says that the reason why the rabbis required the digging of a hole when it's less than 4 square amos is because in an area of 4 square amos, the water seeps into the ground, and therefore it's less likely for it to run off into Rishus HaRabim. But when you have less than 4 by 4, there's a greater likelihood that the water is going to run off into Rishus Harabim, and therefore they required you to dig a hole, once again to demonstrate that that's not your objective. The question now is, my beinayu, what's the difference between these two opinions? So the Gemara explains, Amar Abaya, Orich Bekatin Ika beinayu. The answer is that what if you have a property that is not perfectly square? If your chutzner is not perfectly square, so then it's, let's say, I had said it's got to be 4 square amos. So if it's a square, then it's 4 by 4. But if it's oblong, if it's rectangular, then it's 2 by 8. So according to Reb Zera, the runoff and the absorption rate is going to be the same whether it's 4 by 4 or 2 by 8. But according to Reb Zera, if it's got to do with utility, then there's less of the ability to pat down your soil when you've got a rectangular sized piece of property or not a perfectly square piece of property. Then you have less use of water than when you have a perfectly square piece of property. And as such, according to Rabbi, then you would need, in order to satisfy this criteria, you would need each side of your chutzner to at least be 4 amos in order for you to be patur from digging in uka. If any side of your chutzner is less than 4 amos, even if the total square footage is 4 square amos, you would still need to dig in uka, because the utility of sprinkling water to pat down the soil is not as great. You don't have the same opportunity to sprinkle water and pat down the soil when it's not a perfectly square chutzner. Tanan. Now let's take a look at our Mishnah. Chutzner ve'achsadra mitzarfen l'dalet amos. Now we had said that a split level courtyard, which has both the ground floor and the second floor, which is like a deck, those are conjoinable. Those join together to make up your 4 by 4 area. So Bishlam ala Rabbi Zera nicha. It works out well according to Rabbi Zera, because if he's telling me that it has to do with the absorption rates, so presumably the absorption will be the same whether it's on the second floor versus whether it's on the ground floor. Now that may not be so true, because it depends on the substance that you're using, but I guess the Gemara is understanding that the achsadra is also made of some absorbable material, not like the wood decks that we make, but rather it's probably just a mound of soil that was patted down. So therefore the absorption will be the same whether you're using the raised level of the chutzner or the lower level of the chutzner. That works well according to Reb Zera, l'Rabba kasha. But according to Rabba, and the havamina of the Gemara is that the raised part of the chutzner is not flush against the ground floor, but that the accessibility is only through some narrow passageway between the top level and the lower level. And as a result, because the passageway is not so easily accessible, so then the amount of water that you would normally use to pat down the soil is significantly diminished. So what's Rabbi going to do with this illustration in the Mishnah that allows you to conjoin the achsadra and the chutzner to make up the 4 by 4? It doesn't seem to work according to Rabbi. So the Gemara answers, Tirgama Reb Zera aliba de Rabba be'achsadra maleches al panei kol ha'chutzner kula. The answer would be is that no, we must be talking about where the achsadra and the chutzner are flush up against each other along the entire length of the chutzner, so that the utility is really equally accessible. It's not that you have to go through a narrow passageway in order to get from the raised level to the lower level, but rather the utility is just as easy to sprinkle water on a split level chutzner as it is on a flat chutzner. Tashma. Let's look at the next brisa. Chutzner shein ba dalet amos al dalet amos ein shovchen l'socha mayim b'Shabbos. Here the brisa is quite explicit. It says that if it's not a 4 by 4 chutzner, which implies a square, then you're not allowed to pour water into it unless, like we said in the Mishnah, unless you build this hole. So bishlam l'Rabba nichel l'Reb Zera kasha. Now the tables are turned. The language of this brisa implies that it has to be perfectly square. And according to Reb Zera, if it has to do with absorption rates, then it's got nothing, then there's no reason why you should have to require the chutzner to be perfectly square. So it's a kasha on Reb Zera. So Amar Lecha Reb Zera Hamani Rabbanon hi, Umasnis and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov hi. So the Gemara says that Reb Zera will tell you that I grant you that according to this brisa, the chutzner has to be exactly square 4 by 4. Why? Because really the machlokas between me and my chaver Rabba is really a machlokas in the Mishnah between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That, you see, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and the Chachamim argue about the case of an aqueduct. But the machlokes in the case of an aqueduct is revelatory to our situation as well. Because what is their machlokes? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, you can go right ahead and pour water directly into the aqueduct. Because for Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the issue is how much absorption will occur before it's ready to escape my property. And if there's sufficient absorption that will take place, then even if I pour it directly into the aqueduct, it's no big deal. So clearly, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the factor to be concerned with is the rate of absorption. And that's exactly what Reb Zera am saying. But that brisa, the brisa that you cited, disagrees with our Mishnah. That brisa holds like the Chachamim who say that the issue is how much water does a person actually need? And if he disposes of water in a way such that he demonstrates that he doesn't need the water, so then that's why it's usher. You can only pour out the water if you're not demonstrating in the course of pouring out the water that you wish to dispose of the water. See, so Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's issue is that it's got to do with absorption. So even if you want to dispose of the water, as long as there's a good chance that it'll absorb into the ground before it gets out of my property, then it's okay. But according to the Chachamim, it's got to do with demonstration of whether you want the water or whether you wish to dispose of it. And that's why the Chachamim say that you're never allowed to pour the water directly into the aqueduct. And similarly, it's that same Chachamim who would hold that the chutzner has to be exactly 4 by 4, because then, by pouring out the water, there's not a demonstration that you wish to dispose of it, because that water could theoretically be used to pat down the soil of your property. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, you're telling me now, Reb Zera, that our Mishnah goes like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and the Brisa goes like the Chachamim. Umay duchke de Rabbi Zera leukma lemasnisin Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. What's coercing, what's forcing Reb Zera's hand to say that our Mishnah is going like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? Why don't you say it goes like the Chachamim? And therefore, you could say that our Mishnah also requires a perfectly square chatzar. Omar Rava masnisin kishise. The answer is, says Rava, it's the language itself of our Mishnah. Because my area detani chatzar shehi bechusa, listening chatzar shein badalat amos al dalat amos. Elalav shmamina der Eliezer ben Yaakov he shmamina. The answer is because our Mishnah does not say that the chatzar has to be 4 by 4. Our Mishnah simply says that it has to be 4 square amos. So the fact that our Mishnah is sufficiently vague implies that it doesn't have to be a square chatzar. And therefore you have to conclude that the issue is not the utility of the water that's at stake, but rather the absorption rates of the soil. And as long as the soil can sufficiently absorb the water that I'm spilling out, then I can go right ahead. And that implies, therefore, that the chatzar does not have to be perfectly square. So frak the Gemara, v'hamid de Seifa Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Reish alav Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The Gemara says, wait a minute, that's very difficult to read into our Mishnah, because according to what you're saying, then the primary author of the very first part of our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. But if you look at the language of the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's name is only introduced in the middle of the Mishnah, which implies that the previous part is not Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So how do you deal with that? Answers the Gemara, Kula Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov v'chasirei mechzer avahachi ketani. The answer is that really the authorship of our Mishnah is completely Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And the way that you read the Mishnah, you have to twist it a little bit. You have to, there's a chasirei mechzera, there's a little piece missing from our Mishnah that has to be read in. And you read it as follows. Chatzar shipchusa midalat amos ein shofchen l'sochem ayim b'Shabbos. That if you have a chatzar that's less than 4 square amos, you're not allowed to pour water into it unless you dig an uka. And ha dalat amos shofchen. But if it's 4 by 4, if it's 4 square amos, then it's perfectly fine, even if it's oblong and it's not completely square. Why? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov oimer bib hakomor dalat amos b'rshus harabim shofchen l'sochem ayim b'Shabbos. Because Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is of the opinion that as long as an aqueduct is covered and it runs for at least 4 amos before running into Rishus Harabim, you can pour water into it because you can assume that the water will safely absorb before it runs out into Rishus Harabim. Now let's go weiter. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Bib HaKamor, let's go back to that case of the aqueduct. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that you're allowed to have an aqueduct and you can pour water directly into it. Masnisan delo kechananya. Our Mishnah is not like Chananya. Remember, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says you can pour water directly into an aqueduct, whether the aqueduct is on the ground level of your chutzner, whether it's on your rooftop. As long as you have 4 amos where the water can absorb, it's okay. But that's not like Chananya. The Tanya Chananya Omer afilu gag meya ama lo yishpoch lefi she'ein hagag osui livloa elo lekaleach. That Chananya says that even if a rooftop is 100 amos, you're not allowed to pour water into an aqueduct. And the reason is because the whole function of a rooftop is to run off water into its eaves trough, which is a great Canadian word, which in the States we just use the word gutter, right? But I like the eaves troughs, just sounds so much nicer.
More refined.
It's more refined.
More British.
Exactly. Yeah, British, right. So the whole point of a rooftop is for the water to run off into the eaves trough. So if you pour the water directly into the eaves trough, then according to Chananya, it's not okay. And this is really, Chananya is very logical when you think about it. Pouring water into a groove or an aqueduct in my chotzer, well there, it's much more likely that the water is going to absorb into the ground. But when you pour water on top of a roof, no one wants water to absorb into their roof. And therefore, Chananya is very sensible. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov just basically makes a low plug. He says, listen, the Chachamim would never geyser on any surface, whether it's a roof surface or a ground surface, as long as you're pouring the water onto your property, and in theory, if it's the right substance, the surface can absorb the water, then we're not worried if it's going to run off into Rishus Harabim. Now, Tana, B'med dvarim amurim b'yamos hachama, aval b'yamos hageshamim, shofech v'shona ve'eno nimna. Now, this brisa says that the only time that there's ever any restriction that you and here the Bryce is talking about where if you have a chutzner that's less than 4 by 4 and you need to dig an uka, you need to dig a hole. That's only true in I lost the place in the summertime. But in the wintertime, a person can pour with complete impunity and doesn't even have to dig an uka. So the Gemara says, "My taima." What's the reason? Amar Rava Adam rotza sheivlu umayim b'makoma. The answer is, says Rava, is that in the winter you're happy for the water to stay on your property. The only time that you want water to run out of your property is in the summer when you want the kids to play in the backyard. But in the winter it's already muddy. It's already a big mess outside in your backyard, in your chutzner. And therefore, you don't care if the water stays in. You're perfectly happy for the water to stay in. So therefore, you can pour out the water, and they're not demonstrating that you want it to run out. So Amarle Abaya v'harei shofchin d'adam rotzer she'ivlu ktani lo yishpoch. But Abaya says, but 1 second. We had seen the case of the bib, that if you have an aqueduct in your property, even though a person may very well want the water to remain in his property, but if you're pouring it out in such a way where it's inevitably going to pour out into Rishus Harabim, the Chachamim say you're not allowed to pour it directly into the aqueduct. So here too, how can you tell me that it's okay to pour the water into my less than 4 by 4 chotzer if you know for sure that the water is going to spill out? So Amar Lei Hasam Lamai Nechoshla. So Rabbi's response to him was that in that scenario where you're pouring the water direct, in the case where the chutzner is in the winter months and you're pouring it without an uka, he says because there's nothing to worry about. Imishum kilkul chatzera hamikalkalo v'kaima. If you don't care about your chutzner getting muddy because it's already muddy. Ve'imishum gezera shema yomru tzinor shel ploni mekaleach mayim stam tzinoros mekalchem hein. And if you're concerned that maybe by letting the water run out of my property, people will see a stream of water coming out of my property and running through the Rishus Harabim, and they're going to say that Ploni is Machal Shabbos because he pours water out into Rishus Harabim. During the winter, you have nothing to worry about because the streets are filled with flowing water from people's eaves troughs all over the place. And therefore, there's no one's going to accuse you specifically of pouring water out into Rishus Harabim. So that's why in the winter months, there's no restriction of having to dig a hole. Amar of Nachman, b'yamos hageshamim uka machzik sasayim, nosin lo sasayim, machzik sa'a, nosin lo sa'a. B'yamos hachama, machzik sasayim, nosin lo sasayim, sa'a, ein nosin lo kol ikar. So the Gemara says now, Rav Nachman has a slightly different shita. He says that I hold you always have to dig an uka, whether it's the winter or the summer. However, the distinction between winter and summer is as follows. In the winter, if you have a hole that can hold 2 sa'as of water, then we allow you to pour out 2 sa'as of water. If, however, the hole only holds 1 sa'a of water, then we only allow you to pour out 1 sa'a of water. But in the summer, then we require you always to have a hole that is at least 2 sa'as large. If it's less than 2 sa'as large, then we don't allow you to pour out water at all. So now the Gemara says, why not? Why, if a guy only has a hole that holds 1 sa of water, then let's just let him in the summer also pour out 1 sa of water and let it catch in the hole. The Gemara answers, the answer is because we're worried in the summer that a person may end up, since the average person's usage of wastewater is 2 sa'as, we can't just allow him to limit himself to 1 sa of water, because since he usually uses more water, we're worried that he'll abuse the privilege and he'll end up pouring 2 sa'as, and since the hole can't hold that amount, it'll run off into Rishus HaRabim. So frek the Gemara, ihachi b'yamos hageshamim nami ligzor. Well, then why aren't we worried in the winter? So the Gemara answer is hasam mai nechashla, because in the winter, what are you worried about? Imishum kilkul hamikalkala v'kaima. If you're worried about the fact that a guy wants the water to run out because he doesn't want his chutzner to get muddy, well, it's already muddy, so that's not a concern. If you're worried that maybe people are going to say, when they'll see water running out into Rishus HaRabim, and they'll say that it's Ploni who poured the water out, that you don't have to worry about either, because the streets are filled with water that's coming from everyone else's eavesdrops. So therefore, the Gemara says, in the winter, even if a guy only has a small hole, we let him pour out as much water as he wants. So Amar Abaye Hilka Chafilu Kur Vafilu Kuraim. Abaye then basically says the halacha as follows: that as long as a person digs a hole in the Yamos HaGeshamim in the winter months with the proper measurement, then he can pour out as much water as he wants. In the winter, there's no limit to how much water you can dispose of. It sounds like from Abaye that in the summer you're only allowed to pour out 2 sa'as of water when you have a 2 sa'a hole. But in the winter, there's no limit to how much water you can pour out, because we're not worried that that's going to look like Marasayan, because there's water running out all over the place.
There would be 2 shows at a time. You could go back 5 minutes later and pour out another 2.
Right. It seems that way. Is that what the art scroll points out?
No, it doesn't say anything. I'm just asking. I'm not sure.
It could be. It could be that maybe if you wait for the water to absorb into the hole and then it runs and then the hole empties, maybe then you'd be allowed to repeat. I don't know. And the last thing that we saw in the Mishnah is that if you have 2 patios of 2 houses that are sharing the same chutzner, and then you have the uka is next to one diyut, is next to one patio, and the other patio doesn't have this uka, so then only the patio that has the hole on the ground is allowed to pour water on its diyuta, and then it will spill out onto the chutzner and into the hole. But the other house is not allowed to spill out water at all. So the Gemara now says, Amar Rava afilu irvu. So Rava says this is true even if the 2 houses made an eruv. You're not allowed to spill out the water. So Amar Abaya my taima. Ilema mishum nefisha demaya. So Abaya says, well, why should that be? If they made an eruv, what's the problem? If you're worried about because now there's going to be twice as much water and the hole is not going to be able to contain all that water, the hatanya echas li uka ve'echas li gistera berecha the areva afal pishin ismalu mayim me'erev Shabbos shovchin l'socha mayim b'Shabbos. He says, look, well, what's the problem? Whatever kind of receptacle of water you build, whether it's a hole or whether it's a large shard or whether it's a trough to be able to catch the water, any of these things that are constructed to catch the water, even if they're filled with water from before Shabbos, as long as it's there to show that you don't have a desire dafka for the water to run out of your property, then it's okay to add water even to a filled hole. So you see that even if there's twice as much water than you normally need, as long as you've got the hole that can hold 2 sa'as, there's no restriction. So ella I itmar hachi itmar. So rather, if anything was stated, it was stated as follows: Amar Rava lo shanu ella shelo irvu alval irvu mutarim. But rather, says Rava, what was stated is that the only time that the patio that does not have the hole adjacent to it is not allowed to pour out water is if they did not make an eruv. But if they made an eruv, then it's okay. So correct the Gemara v'chilo irvu my time alo. But wait a minute, even if they didn't make an eruv, what's to stop the people on the patio that's far away from the hole? Let them just pour the water onto their patio, which is their exclusive purview, and it'll run into the chutzner and then run into the hole. What's the big deal? The fear is is that since people have a tendency not to want to muddy up their chatzers, we're concerned that maybe the person that's far away from the hole may inadvertently be tempted to carry a container of water and carry it through the chutzner and pour it into the hole. And since there's no eruv that was made with the chutzner, we cannot allow that. Hadron alach ketzad mishtatfin, and you have